Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com.
The Educational Ministry of Bethany Lutheran Church of Kerman, California supports this podcast through co-host Pastor Greg Camp. Church services are available on Zoom at www.bethanykerman.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another Scriptural Works podcast. Joining me is my co-host Greg Camp. Greg, always good to see you.
Good afternoon, Patrick. It's great to be here.
So we are continuing our series on the Johannine epistles. I learned more and more about them. I thought I knew them when I took introductory Greek way back in the day, but little did I know. I was just scratching the surface. And joining us today is going to be a real treat because he's published a bunch on John and the Johannine epistles in general. Is Chris Seglenieks, all the way over from Australia. Chris, thanks for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you and looking forward to this conversation.
I'm glad to be able to join you.
Oh, thank you. So I'll give a quick intro in terms of Chris and his background so everyone knows who he is. He has done a lot of work on Johannine belief. He has an article actually on that in the epistles on faith. It's an interesting piece, which I actually reread last night, preparing for today's podcast. He's done a lot of work around Greco-Roman devotion and the Johannine community. And we'll talk a bit about that because he has an interesting take. You know, we talked to those who were listening to the series, hopefully heard the podcast with Warren Carter, which was very fascinating. He has a take. Chris has a slightly different take, and we'll ask him to differentiate the two and dive into some of the issues around the community itself. He completed his PhD at the Bible College of South Australia with a thesis on, guess what, Johannine belief and Greco-Roman devotion. It was published as a monograph by Moore Sabeck in Johannine belief and Greco-Roman devotion. We'll include a link to that, by the way, in our podcast posting on the different podcast channels. He currently serves as the academic administrator at Bible College, Australian College of Theology, where he's taught New Testament Greek, various New Testament courses, and he draws on his pastoral ministry experience in Baptist churches across South Australia. He has a long set of article contributions actually on today's topic around the Johannine epistles. I won't go through all of them, but he's published in Novum Testamentum. He's published in Bulletin for Biblical Research. And most recently, he edited a book with Christopher Skinner, and he has an essay or two in it called The Johannine Community in Contemporary Debate. It's right above his head. He can point to it. Published by Lexington Books, Fortress Press. I've read a few of the essays in it. They're really quite fascinating, including the runs by Chris. His research argues, as you go through the different pieces that he's written, and he'll be able to explain this in greater detail, that Johannine belief is best understood as reshaped devotion, integrating cognitive, relational, ethical, and public dimensions. So, Chris, thanks for joining us. We're excited about this conversation. Before we dive into some of our questions for you, I do a quick ad from our sponsor, or one of our sponsors. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu.edu/GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So, Greg, I think you have a few questions that you're going to start with.
Yeah, let's get started off with something you've just mentioned. Chris, in your monograph with Moore Sabeck, you situate Johannine belief within a framework of Greco-Roman devotion. Before we get into any specific text, help us understand what you mean by reshaped devotion. What is that framing, and how is it different than a traditional way, perhaps, of reading Johannine language of pistis as propositional belief?
Sure. So I think one of the issues with that traditional reading of pistis just as propositional belief is that it doesn't do justice to reading that terminology within its context. So in the Greco-Roman world, pistis has a much wider range of meaning. And whilst the idea of propositional belief is part of it, it's often not the primary idea. And here I build on Theresa Morgan's really amazing work across pistis and the Latin term fides as well, looking at how a lot of it is much more relational, more around ideas of trust, and also incorporates a lot more of an active sense as well. So talking about examples of a general who has pistis in his troops, or troops who have pistis in the general as well. It's not just an abstract trust, but that's what it tells us whether they're going to follow orders and things like that. It's very much more an active idea. And here I like some of the ideas that Matt Bates has put out as well, talking about pistis with the idea of allegiance, that sense of not simply an inward academic intellectual idea, but something that also issues in what you actually do. And so what I was trying to do in my book is to really think through, okay, if we're reading the language in its context, how does what John presents as the ideal response to Jesus, how does that compare to how a Greco-Roman audience would have responded to their gods, the sorts of devotion that they would express in that context? And then where are the points of connection, but also where are the differences? What's John doing differently to the world around him as well? And yeah, I think looking at it that way, yes, there certainly is that cognitive idea. There are elements of propositional belief. The fact that John says these things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. There's clearly something that you have to understand and accept there. But there's a lot more going on. There are those ideas of relational connection. There's an ethical component, the idea of acting rightly, and often a public element to it as well, that the devotion is not something internal only, but something that is seen and visible. And so, yeah, I think John is putting out this much broader, richer concept in his gospel, and I think reading it within its cultural context helps us see that.
So it sounds like with the three ways that we tend to translate this word pistis as faith, trust, or belief, you would still accept those three and maybe even add a few others if we had something in English to add to, that it's a fuller term?
Yeah,
or are you suggesting that some of these should be dropped?
No, I certainly wouldn't argue for dropping them. And I guess it's always the challenge of translation is that if we don't have an exact parallel, what do we do there? And so I think ideas of faith and belief certainly are there, but it's trust as well. I think there might be times where we alternate between those in translating John. I think there are some instances where the focus is more relational, and so particularly in the context of talking about ideas of love and things like that, there's a relational focus, whereas other times the focus is a bit more on believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That makes sense to talk in terms of belief there. I'm not entirely convinced by the idea of translating the language of pistis as allegiance necessarily in a translation sense, but I think it's a helpful term to have as part of when we talk about what actually is belief, because there's so many interconnected ideas.
That's helpful.
And before we get into the Johannine epistles, or whatever they are, depending on how you define them, right? They're not. Well, the last two certainly are epistles. The first one, First John, I don't know. I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on that here in a moment. But you have a fascinating way of approaching the Gospel of John as we set the stage for the epistles, where it's sort of a two-layer reading strategy, where you're looking at it from the perspective of the implied author, the implied reader, as well as the characters and the stories themselves. Can you sort of explain that process and how that brings to light an interaction that occurs for one who's actually reading the Gospel of John?
Yeah, so here I'm coming from a fairly narrative approach to the Gospel, trying to read it as a story in the broadest sense. And so, I mean, I got this idea from Seymour Chapman, but I think Jeanette and others have similar ideas that basically any story does operate on two levels. There's the world within the story, where you have the characters interacting, events happening, that sort of thing. But because it's a story, it's not just what's happening in the story, but the story is written for someone. And so there's a layer of communication between the author and the audience. And we might talk about in terms of the implied author and implied reader. But I feel like these documents are written by real people to a real audience, even if we can't identify exactly who those are. So, but yeah, the idea that the author has crafted the story in a way to communicate to his audience to show them particular things. Like that's fairly obvious. Like John himself tells us just before that statement of purpose in 2031, like Jesus did many other signs. He hasn't written everything down. He's chosen the ones to convey what needs to be conveyed about who Jesus is. And I think John is fairly clear on distinguishing between these two levels as well. So obviously, writing the gospel, he's writing from after the resurrection, writing from having a more developed theological perspective of who Jesus is, what his mission was, all those sorts of things. But he doesn't read that into what the disciples did when Jesus was doing his ministry among them. And so we have in chapter 2, the narrator tells us that the disciples didn't understand these things at the time. They only understood later. You get that again in chapter 12, even in chapter 20 with the empty tomb. They hadn't yet understood from the scriptures that Jesus needed to rise from the dead. And I guess you also get within the narrative as well in terms of Jesus at the foot washing, telling Peter that you don't understand what I'm doing now, you'll understand later. And so, yeah, I think John is deliberately keeping these two time periods separate. And I think that has a function in terms of being able to both convey what happened, but also the later interpretation of it. And so, for example, whether it be the stories of Nicodemus or the Samaritan woman, there's that real irony in what they're doing where the reader knows what's going on, and yet we can see these characters misunderstanding, not quite getting there. Like for Nicodemus, not understanding this idea of being born again or born from above. And yet in the prologue, we've already been told that those who receive Jesus will be children of God. And so the reader knows what's going on, even if the characters within the story don't. And so there's that dramatic irony going on. But also helps us see the characters developing and struggling to get there, while also pointing towards where they're supposed to arrive at. And so for the post-cross audience who are reading this gospel, they're not supposed to just imitate what the characters in the story do or understand or anything like that. They're supposed to see where they do the right thing, but also see we're supposed to get beyond that. So for example, I don't see any one character within the gospel as an ideal believer or an ideal disciple, because none of them quite get it right. We're sort of like supposed to bring together what we can see from all the different characters and go, this is where what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Chris, in addition to these characters, as you say, who don't quite get it or they're slow to get it at best, there's another group that you address, the untrustworthy believers. This seems to be John's language for those who believe, but whose belief is somehow deficient. What's John's rhetorical strategy? What's he doing here? And why does it matter for how we read what the community situation is, about what he's writing about?
So here I think perhaps one of the things John is responding to is a similar problem to what we can get today in terms of having a simplistic idea of what it means to believe. And so what we see is repeatedly through the gospel, groups of people are presented in language with language that suggests they're responding rightly to Jesus, but then there's like a switch where it's suddenly called, actually they didn't quite get it. And so the first time is in John 2:23-25, where many people believed in his name, but then we're told that Jesus does not entrust himself to them. And that entrust is the same verb as pisteuo, as believing. And so I wouldn't translate it this way, but you could sort of say that Jesus doesn't believe in their belief. And so there's clearly, they haven't quite got it yet. And I personally, I don't think that this passage tells us why they don't quite get it. I think the idea of there being signs faith, which is somehow an inadequate belief, I think that's reading too much into John. I think the signs, he's pretty clear, are there to prompt belief. They're supposed to have a positive result in terms of leading people towards belief. So I don't think the issue here is the signs. I think they just haven't quite got there yet. There's supposed to be something more. And so then for the reader, we see, they didn't quite get there. What else is needed? What more do I need to do? And so then we see in chapter 6, you've got all these disciples following Jesus, but then some of them turn away and don't follow him anymore because they're not able to accept his message. And so there you've got an idea that, well, believing requires this acceptance of the message, even if it's difficult to understand or difficult to accept. Or similarly in John 8, when John is talking with the Jewish crowds there, some of them seem to believe in him, and he presses them to go further. The idea of like abiding in his word, for example, I think is what's talked about there. That need to, again, a greater acceptance, a greater living into his message, and they're not able to accept that at that point. And then the final example I'll point out would be in John 15, where you have these branches which are described as being in Jesus, but then are cut off and burned up because they're not abiding in him, they're not bearing fruit. And so presenting this idea of there's a need for that, both that ongoing relational connection, but also for that outward visible response of bearing fruit. And so I think each time this comes up, the reader is being pushed to go, okay, is there something more I need to be doing? Have I responded fully, or have I just responded on a more surface level that haven't quite got there? And we might see someone like Nicodemus as a bit of an example of someone who's struggling through these steps across the gospel as well.
Right. Now, would you draw a parallel to those characters who are somehow pulling back, getting cut off in chapter 15, to what First John talks about with secessionists, people who once belonged to, but now have departed? Do you think that same kind of reality is going on?
I guess there probably could be some of that similar connection going on there. You've got people who had some sort of connection to Jesus, but haven't continued. In 1 John, there is at least some sense of there being a theological issue, the idea of believing that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, whatever exactly that means. There seems to be some sort of theological dimension to it as well as their departure. And I guess the challenge there is that the focus of 1 John isn't on the people who've left; it's on the people who are staying. And so,
That's a perfect segue. And we need to have you back to talk about John just in general. We could do multiple episodes on that, needless to say. But you have this concept of pisteuo in John. It carries over into First John. Anyone who's translated First John, it's all over the place. And the concept of remaining or abiding in is there as well. Now, you argue in your articles, like a couple of them that I've read, that we've underplayed pisteuo and what it means. It's more than a cognitive act, but it extends into ethics, which is really quite interesting. That's the name of, I think, one of your articles. Can you walk us through what that process looks like, and talk a bit about the narrative, the rhetorical texture that we see happening in First John that helps that play out for us?
Sure. So I guess my thinking about 1 John probably has been influenced by what I've seen in the gospel, where these connections are developed at much greater length. But I guess to start off with, yes, 1 John does have some interest in propositional belief. We still get some of those believing that sort of phrases like in the gospel. So I'm certainly not trying to say that that's not a concern in 1 John. But that's only part of the picture, I think. And if you read 1 John, there's a lot more of a focus, I think, on questions of ethics. There's a lot about, do you love your brother or hate them? That sort of idea there. And those are tied into one's relationship with God. So the idea that you can't love God and hate your fellow believer, they're just so incompatible. And so I think one of the things that 1 John does is it develops both the idea of believing in a more cognitive and in a relational sense as well. So you get the ideas of both love and cognitive belief, but also these ethical obligations as well. And I argue that these are particularly brought together at the start of chapter 5 in 1 John, which is also the one time in all of the gospel and letters where we get the noun form pistis rather than either the verb or the adjective. And I think it's helpful to see that the verb, the noun, the adjective here have slightly different semantic ranges. So the verb, which is very much the primary focus in the gospel, is much more around ideas of relational trust and cognitive belief. Those are sort of the primary focus there, whereas the adjective, usually translated faithful, is very much more focused on really active faithfulness, doing the right things related to the underlying faith. And the noun bridges across those two, so it has elements of trust, but also has those more practical outworkings as well. And so I think when John talks about our faith in chapter 5, verse 4, I think that's bringing together the two strands of the outward and the inward to present, essentially a holistic response, one that is embodied and cognitive, and is really, I guess, trying to inspire his audience to fully live out their devotion to Jesus.
And the ethics you're talking about here, Chris, are largely inward. It's an intra-communal ethic. It's not really outward focused outside of the Christian community for the writer of
So some people have tried to read every single ethical statement in 1 John as saying this is what those outsiders are doing, and for me that doesn't really fit with what the text is doing. Though the statements in 1 John are very broad, big picture sort of statements that things like loving or hating your brother. Yes, occasionally that's worked out in practice in terms of actually meeting their physical needs, but it doesn't read like it's critiquing specific things that a specific group has done, which along with that general tone of the letter it's a pastoral letter. It's not trying to persuade outsiders. It's not trying to convince someone that, the author's not trying to persuade anyone that his view is right. He doesn't try and defend his view of Jesus or anything like that. He's writing to people who have mostly got it right, who are on his side, who are going to agree with him on most things, and they just need some encouragement in the face of some of these people deserting. Encourage them to just keep doing the right thing and do it all the more, perhaps.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned the noun use of pistis in 1 John 5:4, and in that passage, he's saying, "For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith." Describe a little bit more of what that "our faith" is doing in that sentence. How is it a victory over the world?
So I think this is where perhaps it's helpful to read 1 John alongside the gospel and Jesus' words around overcoming the world. And so I think the idea here is not that sort of triumphalistic victory over the world in a visible outward sense, but rather it's a call for people to live into Jesus' victory. So live in the way that Jesus did, the way he calls his followers to. And in the same way then that the cross can be glorification for John, so too faith can be a victory over the world because it perseveres, because it is not corrupted by the outside world, not because it defeats the world in a sort of triumphalistic sort of sense. And I guess we might see a similar idea coming out, say, in the letters of Revelation, where it's all about conquering the world by staying faithful. So.
Yeah, it sounds like the verb or the noun form is going back to that verbal form by staying faithful, by having this trust that overcomes, rather than I believe the right thing, I think the right thing, and that's somehow victorious.
Well, I think it includes the thinking the right way, but also the trusting and the living that trust out by being faithful in the world. And so, I think the fact that this is the one time that this noun form appears across the whole Gospel and letters, there has to be a reason for the author to choose to use this here and now rather than just using the verb again. And I think that's deliberately trying to bring together a broader idea.
And he adds the our in front of it. It's something that they collectively have.
Yes. So, it's part of that community because he's trying to build that community up rather than, as I said, necessarily reaching out to those who've left.
And when you look at the use of our, it's creating an affinity with the writer and the readers, I would think, the audience, if you may. And how does that work in regards to the sessionists? The sessionists, are they ones who went out for the recipients of 1 John? Because he uses it, they went out from us, but they were not of us. Is it the writer's community, or is it the writer and the recipient's community? What's your view on that? And then, how does that play into, is this a letter per se, or is it maybe something different like a speech or a sermon? What's your view in regards to what is 1 John? Is it an epistle or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. It clearly doesn't follow the traditional features of a letter in the Greco-Roman world. We have so many of them, and as you said before, like 2 and 3 John very easily fit into that sort of model. We've got the clear introduction, clear conclusion. It falls into that pattern, whereas 1 John doesn't. It doesn't have that introduction to who's writing it, who are they writing it to. Yeah. There's no final greeting like that, and so I guess it's hard to say it's just a letter. Mm-hmm. As to what exactly it is, it does. That pastoral function makes it feel somewhat like a sermon, but at the same time, obviously, it has been written rather than just spoken, and so I guess it's tricky to work out exactly how it's functioning. But I guess what I'd see is that I think there are several communities which are connected, not necessarily in a formal organizational sense, but in a more relational sense, and I think 2 and 3 John show that there are letters being passed between these communities. So it could be that 1 John is something more like a sermon that's written to be read out in a neighboring group, something like that. And if we go with the traditional identification of the Johannine writings coming out of Ephesus or somewhere like that, we've got plenty of evidence for very early Christian communities in a dozen or more towns and cities throughout Asia Minor there. And so it could well be any number of those having some connection and interacting with each other at a bit of a different distance. And so, I think the author is presumably someone who has some authority, respect across the groups, but it's very hard to nail that down.
That's very, and it would flow into some of the argument that Greg's doctoral professor, Loveday Alexander, wrote about how documents floated around between, from a patronage standpoint, between different communities. That would feed into your argument. What happens with the view of the sessionists then, in light of there's sort of an intertwining of these communities? Are the sessionists, going out from the group of churches or the writer's church, or how's that play out in your mind?
So I guess from 1 John, it seems like they were part of the group, the audience of 1 John, and they've left them. Now, how much of a formal group these secessionists make up, it's really hard to say. Because the focus is not on them, we don't. They're really shadowy. They've left. They had the wrong ideas. They haven't they haven't stayed faithful. Beyond that, we're not really told much about them. But we do get the sense in 2 John that there are other people floating around this network who may come with wrong ideas, not agreeing with the theology of the group, and with the instructions there to welcome them in, that sort of thing. So it could be that they then tried to move out to one of the other Christian groups in the area. I know some people have suggested maybe they went back to a Jewish synagogue instead. Either of those are certainly possible, but again, they're not the focus of these letters, so it's very hard to say much about them.
Chris, dealing with the Johannine community is like a moth to the flame. It's like we can't avoid it, partly because of this talk about us and you and those who have left us. But you've worked on language of divergent outgroup narratives using social identity theory, and you have a methodological chapter arguing that we should read the community from the letters rather than from the gospel, that when we merge those, that we might confuse ourselves a bit. Give us a big picture of what you are trying to do with that, and how you differ from other scholars and how they've tried to reconstruct this Johannine community.
Sure. So I guess it might help to just paint a broad picture of what the scholarly debate around the Johannine community has been. And so this really comes out of the work of Raymond Brown and Lee Martin, who basically have read the gospel as encoding stories of the community of the audience, and essentially reading their experience back into the life of Jesus and re-narrating it in the context of Jesus' ministry. Now, as we've already talked about with the idea of a two-level reading, I think that goes against what the author is clearly trying to do. I think the author is clearly trying to distinguish between the time of Jesus' ministry and his later context. So I don't think that's helpful. But the result of Martin and Brown's work has been quite widely accepted across Johannine scholarship in the last quarter of the 20th century, shall we say, with this idea that there was a group that split from a Jewish synagogue, and that was sort of a formative experience for them. And then the gospel is written specifically to and for this group. And then Brown particularly incorporates the letters as well to tell the later story of the community and their experience with the secessionists as another stage in this. Now, the first probably big counter to this came from Richard Balcombe with his idea of Gospels for all Christians, the idea that the Gospels are not letters. They're not written to one single localized community, but written to a much wider audience. Now, I think on the one hand, that's very helpful. I think recognizing that difference in genre and purpose between a gospel and a letter is essential, that they're not doing the same thing. We can't read them in the same way. Like the gospel doesn't tell us a particular local audience. It doesn't tell us explicitly the issues that this group is having, like we might see, say, in Corinthians. We can see these are all things going on in the community. A gospel doesn't tell us that. I think perhaps the flaw to Balcombe's idea and the way it's been adopted is that at least some people then completely divorce the Gospel of John from any specific context. But obviously, the author had to be somewhere while he was writing. Like he would have needed the time, the space to write this Gospel. If he didn't have a community around him, who would have copied it, sent it on to the next group, and all those sorts of things. And even if the author has some sense of trying to write for all Christians everywhere, they're likely to have a more concrete intended audience, the people they know, the people they think about as they're deciding, okay, which story shall I include or not include? What do the people need to know? So there's likely to be a sense where it is written in a concrete context to some sort of a defined audience, even if it's a broader idea. And I think the other methodological issue we need to at least account for is the work of Stan Stowers and after him Sarah Rollins, talking about just the way that all of our New Testament texts are rhetorical. They're not simply reflecting what is, but they also point towards what ought to be and try and evoke a response in their audience. And so to simply read a text as a window into the past doesn't work. We have to be attentive to where are they representing what is and where are they trying to bring about the response that should be in the mind of the author. And so what that's led to in terms of my way of thinking through things is first of all to set the gospel to the side to start with because it's not written for a specific local group, even if it does have a context, that context is not going to be something we can read out as easily. And now that's obviously a challenge to then interpret a gospel, but because we have the Johannine letters, which in my understanding, they are closely connected, I'm still, let's say, agnostic about whether it's a common author or not. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But then these letters are written to specific local groups, or in the case of the Third John, an individual within a group. And so they do reflect the specific context of the author and the audience there. And so trying to read through the letters first, with that framework of going, some of this is reflecting what is happening, and some is what the author thinks should be happening. Doing that, we can try and create a picture of what does this group look like as a starting point. And so we can see at least there's this network of connected communities which are talking to each other. We can see they do have a shared theology, because the letters aren't particularly trying to persuade anyone of a theological position. And yet this theology that they share is also essentially the boundary marker. That's what defines who is part of the group and who isn't. Now, alongside that, there's this clear ethical concern as well, comes through in the letters, just like it does in the gospel. And that seems to be a key pastoral concern, is to encourage the readers to act rightly, and primarily to keep on acting rightly and to act rightly more, rather than stop doing the wrong thing, start doing the right thing. One of the things I did find looking at the letters this way is that there's very little indication of a social or cultural context, in as far as, particularly, we don't get that much indication of a conflict with a Jewish group. So the letters just don't talk about, there's no mention of a synagogue, there's no arguments around law or circumcision or things that we see in other New Testament texts, where there is some sort of perhaps disagreement between Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus or anything like that. There's just none of that in the letter. And neither do the letters seem to be overtly appealing to a solely Jewish audience. Like, they're not making that bigger use of scripture, for example. Like in 1 John, there's one clear use of the Old Testament, and that's not a quotation. It doesn't require you to even know the story to understand what's going on. And it's used as an illustration for the ethical point that the author is making. And so if we think about this picture of a Johannine community, that's very different to the idea of a community that is primarily defined by its split with a synagogue. And so if we come to the gospel going, this seems to be the picture of the context within which the gospel was likely to be written, that is really changes what we assume about that context. And that has implications for then how do we read the gospel? What do we see the gospel's main idea? It's not about how are we relating to our Jewish context. It's about Christology, it's about ethics. And those are the big ideas, rather than, there's this conflict with the synagogue.
It seems, we have this obsession, or we focus, however you want to describe it, with the sessionist in 1 John, and perhaps the two actual letters. And as a result, that has distracted us from this pastoral element that you described, that I suspect you've seen really resonate in the churches where you've taught this, you've preached, 1 John. What comes out that often gets missed because we're trying to do this reductionist reconstruction of the community, whereas we're not looking at the argument, the rhetoric of the text, and seeing what it's trying to address and propose in terms of what this new ethic looks like for the community.
Yeah, like if you focus on the context, and especially if you get the context really wrong, you're going to miss what is the author actually trying to do. Like, what is his purpose in writing this text? What response is he seeking to evoke? And so, yeah, like with 1 John, it's not a polemic against people out there. It's about the people in here and encouraging them in their faith, in their relationship with Jesus, in their practical life and ethics. And so, yeah, to focus on the outsiders is to miss the point of 1 John. And I think similarly with the gospel, to get caught up on this idea of being put out of the synagogue is to miss the point of what John is doing. And so coming back to the gospel, having thought about what's going on with the letters, it's interesting to see, first of all, you've got a different portrayal of how the author is seeing the outgroup and the relationship between us and them. So in 1 John, where you've got an us and a them, and them, they're the ones who have left us. In the gospel, the picture that's being presented is more of, we've got us and the them are kicking us out. It's more of that overt response. But then, if we actually look at the points at which we have this idea of being put out of the synagogue, it doesn't actually happen. Like, no one in the gospel is put out of the synagogue. People are afraid of being put out of the synagogue, but it doesn't actually happen. And so I think when we notice that and when we see what's going on with John, we can see, actually, this is just another part of that big picture purpose of John, trying to teach people what does belief look like, how to believe. And part of that is to go, okay, yes, you're going to be scared of people out there trying to make life harder for you. But if you live in a way that's shaped by that fear, well, you're not responding rightly to Jesus. And so, to see what's going on with that context is to be able to see what is John actually doing.
Chris, that's a great way to draw the attention back to the more positive message that the texts are trying to do, rather than trying for us to identify what went wrong with some group. Here's what the author's trying to help these various communities who are reading, whether it's the gospel more widely or the letter that's being circulated. So this provides a little bit of a step back to your monograph, where you situate Johannine belief within broader Greco-Roman religious environment, particularly the concept of devotion, which is what John or the author is trying to get them to do. How does that broader cultural religious context reframe some of that language of John about belief that we might miss for two reasons? One, we're focusing in the wrong place. We're focusing on people who left. And we're not picking up on some of the belief language in terms of the cultural context. What did you find you can share with us?
Yeah, so I guess it's certainly no surprise to anyone to say that John is concerned with belief. Plenty of people have noticed that. He uses the language so much that it's very hard to miss that. But I guess the problem is that can be read in a more simplistic way, that focus on just what do you need to believe, or perhaps who do you need to believe, which are both important ideas in John, but it's certainly not the only thing. And so to look at it more broadly in the context of Greco-Roman religion, and what would they have assumed that devotion to the gods meant? So I think all of the things that we see in John have some resonance with the context, that John is not necessarily introducing completely radically new ideas, save perhaps in terms of the identity of Jesus himself, but in terms of the response that people are supposed to make, we do see ideas of cognitive belief, of relational devotion, of some sort of ethical obligations coming up in the Greco-Roman world. Now, most of these things are less prominent in that Greco-Roman world than they are in John, or often they're more implicit. They're the sort of things that are only made explicit in their absence or when they're under threat. And so you get ideas of the need for ongoing devotion to the gods. That's just assumed for the most part, up until you come to some sort of a crisis. You've got a city's having a plague, okay, well, this must be happening because we haven't kept up our devotion to the gods, and we need to renew our efforts now. And so it's sort of most of the time implicit, but comes out in those points of crisis. And so, like, yeah, there is cognitive belief in the Greco-Roman world. It's not the emphasis, but there is a need to know who are the gods, what are those gods supposed to do, what are the right things we're supposed to do for the gods, all those sorts of things. Like, you can't express devotion to the gods unless you know which one you're supposed to, like, who are you supposed to pray to if you want your ship to arrive safely at its destination or something like that. Like, there has to be a cognitive side to it. We do see relational elements to the devotion, which is a lot more variable. Like, there's not necessarily that same individual personal relationship, although by the 1st century AD, we are seeing more of that in some of the, particularly some of the more voluntary cults, we might call them, things like the cult of Isis, which is not one of the traditional Greek or Roman gods, has come with Egyptian influences and things like that. But we do get stories of devotees who have more of a personal relationship, can talk about visions and dreams and things like that. The ethical side of things, I mean, there's a general sense that the gods are concerned with how people should live. There are plenty of people who are wronged who appeal to the gods for justice, for vengeance, that sort of thing. So those sort of things we've talked about with the Gospel of John are there in the wider world. John reshapes those, gives those a greater importance. And perhaps the biggest contrast is in the Greco-Roman world, religion is primarily about ritual. There's a very central role for sacrifice, for processions, for all of these events and communal activities, which is surprisingly absent from the Gospel of John. And I think even if we compare John to our other Gospels, anything ritualized is decreased. So John only indirectly narrates Jesus' baptism. We don't get the Last Supper. John just skips over that. And so I think the big picture of what John is doing is, within this wider Greco-Roman world, he's saying not just Jesus is supposed to be where you direct your devotion, but this is what devotion to Jesus looks like. And some of that flows out of just who is Jesus, because of who Jesus is, what is the appropriate devotion to him. But yeah, because it's not the same as what's in that wider world, John has to actually teach people, this is how you believe. And so hence why it's such a great focus on believing, abiding, keeping Jesus' commands, all those things that form part of the ideal response that John wants people to have towards Jesus.
Chris, there's a confessional connection, obviously, Jesus, the Son of God, etc. And that is connected to ethics and what one does, obviously. You may speak to that. And then second of all, can you speak to, we talk ethics, love one another. What's that mean from a Johannine standpoint? Does it go into, okay, loving one another means hospitality. Loving one another means you turn the other cheek. You have more prescriptive answers, I think, to that question in other New Testament texts. Does John give us a glimpse in terms of what does that mean for him?
Yeah, so again, what I'm trying to do is to steer between extremes of solely focusing on trust or cognitive belief, or or even just trying to make everything about those facts that you want to believe. I think John really combines these ideas of believing in who Jesus is and how one lives. And essentially that's because ethics flows from who Jesus is. Like, you have to know who Jesus is to know how you ought to live in response. And I think some of that comes out in the gospel. I think the clearest example, though, is in 1 John. Like, we love because he first loved us. Like, that makes it very explicit that what you're supposed to do is entirely flowing from who Jesus is and what he did. We might see a concrete example in terms of the foot washing in John 13, where Jesus is explicit. He says, I've done this as an example for you. So I think we do get some of that concrete example happening there. But I think because of that broader picture of it's about who Jesus is, we're supposed to see the whole portrait of Jesus in the gospel and go, that is how we're supposed to live. So rather than having to point to specific, in this example, this is what you should do, John's not so concerned about those small details. He's just thinking about big picture, orientation of life. Look at how Jesus loved, served, all those sorts of things. And that's what you're supposed to do. And I think right throughout, those ideas of the cognitive and the ethical are intertwined. Things like, whoever doesn't love doesn't know God, or in the gospel, anyone who loves me will keep my word. And I think actually the farewell discourse, so John 13 through 17, is where we see the different strands most clearly packaged together as a unit. You can't pick one or the other. It's not believe first, then do something. It's this is the response. It's a whole thing. So take it or leave it. You can't pick a mix. So.
Chris, another way to frame the cognitive and ethical, what sometimes is put as a dichotomy, is perhaps to put it as public and private, or public and secret. So the ethical dimension is almost always, by its virtue, a public dimension, whereas the cognitive can be more secret, more private. It's just something I think, and it doesn't necessarily have to show. In the Johannine context, the secret belief, in whatever form it comes, whether it's secret thoughts or secret actions, don't seem to be very well thought of. Nicodemus, the secret, he comes at nighttime in the gospel. So how is that public-private being played out in the larger Greco-Roman world? Anybody who's been to Ephesus or Laodicea knows that the public side is very, very important. There's lots of public settings, even in the archaeological ruins. Can you say more about what it looks like?
Yeah. So certainly, as you say, the idea of devotion to the gods in the Greco-Roman world is very public. It's you do what, like, even for the simple thought that the altar for a temple was out the front of the temple. You don't go into the temple building. You gather in the space out the front as a community. And so it was necessarily public. What that meant is that if you choose to put your devotion somewhere else, somewhere that doesn't allow for continued devotion to your traditional gods, that's going to be visible. Like, people are going to see that you're not participating there. And so I think one of the things that John is trying to do by including the story of Nicodemus is to speak to the people who are faced with the fear of, if I change my allegiance from our traditional gods to Jesus, people are going to see that, and that's scary. And so here's where I think the vagueness of the outgroup in the Gospel of John, which is often painted as just the Jews, which sometimes seems like it might be the people in general. Often it's more like the Jewish authorities. Sometimes it's just really not clear. I think that makes it easier for a reader to adopt that image that's been given to their particular context and whoever they're scared of being excluded by. And so, and as I said earlier, in the gospel, it's always a potential threat. This exclusion, this being kicked out of the synagogue. And so, in the same way, people might, a Greek in Ephesus could be afraid of being excluded from the public assembly and things like that because of their devotion to Jesus. And so I think the Gospel of John is giving encouragement and prompting to acknowledge that fear and go through it, and to make their devotion public.
Now, Chris, we're about out of time, but I think a couple more questions just to get your perspective. You've been neck deep in Johannine's scholarship for years now. You know it a lot better than Greg, certainly me. Where do you see it going, right? There's been a lot written about characterization. You've written a lot, and several others have, about, don't focus as much on the secessionist and and the adversaries that are being talked about, but rather they're written for pastoral purposes, which has an impact on the actual readers. And you just spoke about one of those vantage points in terms of those who are in the Greco-Roman world and are accustomed to the traditional religious displays and what this means for them. Where do you see, the debate? Obviously, the community thing is not going to go away. But what are some of the things that you see as promising and areas that are going to be explored in further detail, particularly in regards to the epistles, but also the gospel?
Yeah, so certainly with the edited book that we've done on the Johannine community, the real aim for that is to kickstart new discussions, because it feels like we had Raymond Brown and Martin and their idea, which was dominant for a while. We had Balcomb's counter proposal, which some people have adopted, some people haven't. And then the last 25 years, there hasn't been substantial progress forward. There's sort of people have divided into one camp or the other and just sort of stuck with it, more or less. So yeah, very much we're hoping that this will prompt some new thoughts, some new avenues for thinking more about the community. What might it look like in ways that don't just conform to one or other paradigm that's existing? And yeah, part of that is going to be re-examining how do the letters connect to the gospel, and Hugo Mendes has been one that's very much provoked some new ideas in terms of thinking about, well, maybe they're all written by separate people just copying the style of John
And each other. Yeah.
And so, okay, if we take that, what does that mean for how we read the letters, what they're doing, their possible context? And so, yeah, there's very much an ongoing discussion happening there. There's perhaps a broader question of, just where does John fit in with the wider Christian world? So there's been a bunch done just recently on how does John relate to the synoptics? And I guess a revitalization of the idea that John knew probably Mark, maybe all three of the synoptic gospels when he wrote. And that as a way of thinking through then, okay, if he does know one or more of the synoptics, what does that say about what John is doing compared to them? Yes.
Yeah. Chris, as you
do get people trying to put things John earlier again as well, though. I think George Van Kooten had a couple of articles recently trying to say actually John was so much earlier. That would completely, I guess, throw a spanner in the works as to how they all relate.
It's like Jesus going into the temple, just throw over a few tables.
Yeah.
Chris, have you talked through your work in churches, how have people been responding? What kind of new insights are they sharing with you? What's the reception like? And is it giving you any new ideas for different takes on this? I find churches to be places where people can actually push me quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my research did actually originate just with that observation of seeing people in churches having a narrower view of belief sometimes than was helpful. And so, I feel like at least some people being quite positive about the idea of seeing belief as more holistic. I think a lot of people do find it a challenge seeing, I guess, seeing people who call themselves Christians, but their actions don't line up with that. And going, well, how do I deal with that? If they say they believe, well, doesn't that mean they're a Christian and they're fine? But to be able to help people see, well, actually, the Gospel of John paints a fuller, richer picture of what it means to believe. You can't just say one line and everything's fine. So I think that has been helpful for some people. I guess there are probably some people who are a bit more resistant, who are. I guess it makes it harder to draw lines between. Like some people are obviously very attached to creeds and confessions, and the way they can function as boundary markers in ways which are can at times go beyond perhaps what is justified. And so I think certainly there, as I've said, there are things that John is quite insistent, you do need to believe this. Yeah. But at the same time, we probably want to be careful about pushing that too far. And I guess that's perhaps part of where John is calls for unity in John 17. Like, yes, you need some agreement about Jesus for that to be a actual unity in Jesus, mutual indwelling and all of that. But at the same time, we don't want to be drawing unnecessary boundaries that prevent that unity.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've pushed a few tables over, but you haven't taken out the whips to people yet. So
not just yet.
Okay. Make them a little uncomfortable. That's good.
So, Chris, you've been prolific on John and Johannine epistles in particular. Anything? What's your next big research project that's going to be coming out in the next year or so? What are you working on now?
So one of my big things at the moment is starting to include some focus on Revelation and thinking various things. But one of the questions is do we think of Revelation as part of the Johannine literature? And so I've got an edited book hopefully coming out in the next year or so, looking at the question of, does the Gospel of John and Revelation, do they share a theological perspective? Because basically everyone's talked about them in terms of authorship. And so we talk about, like, are they using the same vocabulary? Are they using the same Greek grammatical expressions? Those sorts of things, which I feel like that we've looked at what there is. There's not enough evidence to conclusively decide one way or the other. I don't think that question will get settled to everyone's satisfaction. So, but you do often get the idea that there are some sort of theological affinities between them. And so trying to step back and go, okay, how similar are they theologically? If we try and not focus too much on those surface features, like, do they have the same idea of who Jesus is? Do they have the same idea of the Spirit? Do they have the same idea of humanity or salvation? And try and look at it from that angle.
That's fascinating. That's something we'll be looking for. We'll need to have you back to talk about it. We'll do a series on Revelation.
There you go.
Sounds like fun.
Well, for our listeners, make sure you check out his books. There are links on the podcast channels where you're checking this out, whether it's YouTube or Apple or Spotify. And as always, we appreciate you listening to another one of our podcasts. Chris, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks for making time to speak to us and our audience today.
Thank you.
For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-host Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.